February 14, 1876. The saloon erupted in laughter as ranch hand Thomas Whitfield carried a starving Apache boy through the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, ignoring the jeers and threats from his fellow cowboys, who called him a traitor to his own kind. But when 60 Apache warriors appeared on the horizon 3 days later, those same men who mocked his compassion were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. What did Thomas do in those 3 days that would turn sworn enemies into his fiercest protectors? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory's sun beat down mercilessly on Copper Ridge that February afternoon, 1876, turning the main street into a ribbon of scorched earth and broken dreams. Thomas Whitfield wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his horse through the settlement, returning from a week-long cattle drive that had left him bone-tired and covered in trail dust. At 28 years old, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade working ranches across the Southwest, earning a reputation as a reliable hand who kept to himself and never caused trouble. The town of Copper Ridge sat in a valley between two ridges of red rock, a collection of weathered buildings that served the surrounding cattle ranches and mining operations. The Broken Spur Saloon dominated the center of town, its false front painted a faded red that had long since surrendered to the relentless desert sun. Next to it stood Morrison's General Store, the blacksmith's forge, and a scattering of other businesses that kept the isolated community functioning. Thomas had been riding for the Double Cross Ranch, one of the larger operations in the area, owned by a hard man named Clayton Vickers. Vickers ran his outfit with an iron fist, expecting long hours and unquestioning loyalty from his crew. The pay was decent, but the atmosphere among the ranch hands had grown increasingly hostile over the past year. Tensions with the Apache bands in the surrounding mountains had escalated, and several ranches had lost cattle to raids. Some cowboys had lost friends to skirmishes along the territorial borders. As Thomas approached the outskirts of town, his horse suddenly whinnied and pulled against the reins. Something had spooked the animal. Thomas's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle secured to his saddle, his eyes scanning the scrub brush and scattered rocks along the roadside. Years of frontier living had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every sense told him something was wrong. Then he saw a small figure huddled behind a cluster of barrel cactus, about 30 yards from the road. At first, Thomas thought it might be a coyote or some other animal seeking shade, but as his eyes adjusted, he recognized the unmistakable shape of a child. The figure wasn't moving. Thomas dismounted slowly, leaving his rifle where it was. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel and dried grass. As he drew closer, he could see it was a boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair matted with dirt and blood. The child wore the traditional clothing of the Apache people, a simple cotton shirt and breechcloth, both torn and stained. The boy's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and his small chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen. Every rational thought told him to mount his horse and ride away. The relationship between settlers and Apache in this region had deteriorated to the point of open warfare. Just 3 months earlier, a group of miners had been killed in an ambush 15 miles north. The army had retaliated with brutal efficiency, attacking an Apache camp and killing several warriors. The cycle of violence seemed endless, and anyone caught showing sympathy to the enemy risked being branded a traitor. But as Thomas looked down at the dying child, none of that mattered. He saw only a small boy, alone and suffering, hours away from death in the unforgiving desert. Thomas had been raised by a mother who believed in the simple doctrine that mercy was never wrong, even when it was inconvenient or dangerous. She had died when he was 16, but her words still echoed in his mind during moments like these. Thomas knelt beside the boy and gently touched his forehead. The child's skin burned with fever. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and unfocused. Before closing again, Thomas knew he had to act quickly. He retrieved his canteen and carefully dribbled water onto the boy's lips, watching as the child's body instinctively responded, trying to swallow the precious liquid. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, though he knew the boy probably couldn't understand. English, easy does it. After getting some water into the child, Thomas carefully lifted him. The boy weighed almost nothing, his small frame wasted by days without food or water. Thomas carried him to his horse and managed to mount while holding the child against his chest. The boy's head lolled against Thomas's shoulder as they began the ride into town. Thomas's mind raced as Copper Ridge came into view. He knew exactly what kind of reception awaited him. The men he worked with, hard, bitter men who had lost friends and livestock to Apache raids, would not understand his decision. But the nearest doctor was in town, and if this child was going to survive, he needed medical attention immediately. As Thomas rode down the main street, heads began to turn. A woman gathering laundry stopped mid-reach and stared. Two men loading supplies onto a wagon ceased their work, their faces hardening as they recognized what Thomas was carrying. By the time he reached the hitching post outside Doc Harlan's office, a small crowd had begun to gather. "What in blazes do you think you're doing, Whitfield?" The voice belonged to Jack Cordell, one of the senior ranch hands from the Double Cross. Cordell was a thick-set man in his 40s with a scarred face and a reputation for violence. He stepped off the saloon's wooden sidewalk, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Thomas ignored him and dismounted, still cradling the unconscious child. He started toward the doctor's door, but Cordell moved to block his path. "I asked you a question, Whitfield. You bring an Apache brat into our town?" "He's a child, Jack. He's dying." Thomas's voice was steady but firm. "Now step aside." More men had emerged from the saloon now, and Thomas recognized several faces from the ranch crew. There was Pete Donovan, a young hothead who had only been in the territory for 6 months, but talked the loudest about Indian fighting. Behind him stood Marcus Fleming, the ranch foreman, whose younger brother had been killed in an Apache raid the previous year. Fleming's face was unreadable, but his jaw was set tight. "That child is Apache," Cordell said, spitting the word like a curse. "His people killed my cousin. They burned out the Henderson Ranch last spring. And you want to save him?" "I want to keep a boy from dying in the street," Thomas replied. "That's all." The crowd had swelled to nearly 20 people now, forming a loose semicircle around Thomas and the child. He could feel the hostility radiating from them like heat from a forge. These were people who had buried friends, who had watched their livelihoods threatened by raids, who had learned to view every Apache as an enemy to be destroyed. Cordell took another step forward. "You're making a mistake, Whitfield, a big one. That boy's people are probably the same ones who hit the Mackenzie place 2 weeks ago. They killed old man Mackenzie and his son. Burned everything to the ground. Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "Or maybe he's from a peaceful band that had nothing to do with any raids. Maybe he's lost, separated from his family. I don't know his story, and neither do you. But I know he's dying, and I can help him. That's enough." A new voice cut through the tension. "Let him through." Doc Benjamin Harlan stood in the doorway of his office, a thin man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He had been the only doctor in Copper Ridge for 15 years, treating everyone from gunshot wounds to childbirth complications. "Whatever your feelings, I won't have a child die on my doorstep while you men stand around arguing politics." Cordell's face flushed red. "Doc, you can't be serious. You're going to treat an Apache?" "I took an oath," Harlan said simply. "It didn't include exceptions for race or tribe." "Now clear the way." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Fleming, the foreman, spoke up. Let him go, Jack. Doc's right. Whatever else is true, we're not the kind of men who let children die in the street. Corgill glared at Fleming, then at Thomas, before finally stepping aside with obvious reluctance. You're both fools, he muttered. This is going to bring trouble down on all of us. Thomas carried the boy into the doctor's office, grateful for the relative cool of the interior. Harlan directed him to place the child on the examination table, a sturdy wooden structure covered with a clean white sheet. As Thomas laid the boy down, he got his first clear look at the extent of the child's injuries. Besides the obvious dehydration and malnutrition, the boy had several deep cuts on his arms and legs, some of which showed signs of infection. There was a particularly nasty wound on his left shoulder that looked like it might have come from a knife or possibly an animal attack. Dried blood matted the hair on one side of his head, suggesting a blow that could have caused serious damage. How long has he been out there? Harlan asked as he began his examination, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Hard to say, Thomas replied. Found him about 3 miles out. Based on his condition, I'd guess at least 3 or 4 days. Maybe longer. Harlan nodded grimly as he checked the boy's pulse and breathing. He's in bad shape. Severely dehydrated, malnourished, and these wounds are infected. The head injury concerns me most. Could be a concussion or worse. He looked up at Thomas. You understand what you've done here? Half the town wants to run you out on a rail right now. I understand, Thomas said quietly. But I couldn't leave him out there to die. The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. Your mother would be proud. She was the same way, couldn't abide suffering, no matter whose. Harlan had known Thomas's mother before her death. She had been one of the few people in Copper Ridge who had treated the doctor with respect when he'd first arrived, a stranger. From back east with modern medical ideas, can you help him? Thomas asked. I can try, Harlan replied, already reaching for his medical supplies. But he's going to need constant care for the next few days. That means someone will have to stay with him, monitor his condition. You volunteering for that duty? Thomas hadn't thought that far ahead. Staying in town meant missing work at the ranch, which meant no pay. It also meant enduring the hostility of his fellow townspeople. But looking down at the small helpless form on the table, he knew there was only one answer. I'll stay, he said. Harlan permitted himself a small smile. Then you better settle in. This is going to be a long night. As the doctor worked cleaning and dressing the boy's wounds, Thomas found a chair in the corner and sat down. Through the window, he could see the crowd outside had grown larger. Men gestured angrily, their voices rising and falling, but not quite loud enough to make out specific words. Thomas recognized Clayton Vickers's distinctive black hat among the group now. The ranch owner had arrived, no doubt summoned by one of the crew. This was going to get worse before it got better. Thomas had just painted a target on his back and, in a place like Copper Ridge, where tempers ran hot and violence was never far from the surface, that could be deadly. But as he watched Doc Harlan carefully spooning water into the unconscious child's mouth, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace with his decision. He had learned long ago that a man's character wasn't defined by the choices that were easy or popular. It was defined by what he did when everything hung in the balance, when the cost of doing right was high, and the path of least resistance was clearly marked. His mother had taught him that. She had lived it every day of her life, showing kindness to those the world had cast aside, the drunks, the prostitutes, the outcasts that polite society pretended didn't exist. What's your name? Harlan asked suddenly, looking at Thomas. You. Know my name, Doc. Not yours, his. Harlan nodded toward the boy. Every patient deserves a name. If we don't know his Apache name, we should call him something. Thomas considered this. The boy's face, now that some of the dirt had been cleaned away, showed delicate features and high cheekbones. Despite the injuries and illness, there was something resilient about him, a toughness that had kept him alive when he should have died alone in the desert. "How about Samuel?" Thomas suggested. "It means heard by God. Seems fitting." Harlan nodded his approval. "Samuel it is. Now Samuel. Hare's going to need food once he's able to eat. Something light at first, broth. Maybe some bread softened in milk. You know where to get that." "Morrison's store should have what we need," Thomas said, standing up. "I'll head over there now." "Take the back door," Harlan advised. "The front is still crowded with your admirers." Thomas stepped out into the alley behind the doctor's office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground, and somewhere a dog barked incessantly. He made his way toward Morrison's general store through the back ways, avoiding the main street where the hostile crowd still lingered. Raymond Morrison was a practical businessman who cared more about profit than politics. When Thomas entered through the rear entrance and explained what he needed, Morrison simply nodded and gathered the supplies without comment. As he wrapped the items, however, he leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "You've got guts, Whitfield. I'll give you that, but guts won't stop a bullet. Cordell and his bunch are working themselves into a lather out there. Word is they want to drag that boy out of Harlan's office and finish what the desert started. They'll have to go through me," Thomas said quietly. "That's what I'm afraid of," Morrison replied, handing over the package. "Watch your back. And tell Doc to keep his door locked tonight." Thomas returned to the doctor's office just as full darkness fell over Copper Ridge. The crowd outside had dispersed somewhat, but he could see several men still lingering near the saloon, silhouettes against the warm light spilling from the windows. Their presence felt menacing, like wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside, Harlan had made progress. The boy Samuel was cleaned up and bandaged, his wounds treated with carbolic acid and wrapped in clean cloth. His breathing seemed slightly easier, though he remained unconscious. The doctor had set up a pallet for Thomas on the floor and indicated he would take the first watch, monitoring Samuel's condition through the night. "His fever is still high," Harlan explained. "The next 24 hours will tell us if he's going to make it. If the fever breaks, he's got a good chance. If it DOESN single quotes T. He left the sentence unfinished. Thomas settled onto his pallet, but sleep was impossible. His mind churned with questions about what would happen next. Would Vickers fire him from the ranch? Would Cordell and the others try to force their way into the office? What would happen if when the Apache learned that one of their children was being held in Copper Ridge? That last question troubled him most. If Samuel belonged to a nearby band, his people would be searching for him. When they discovered where he was, they might assume the worst, that the boy was being held hostage or had been harmed by settlers. The fragile peace, such as it was, could shatter completely. And Thomas would be right in the center of the storm. Around midnight, Harlan shook Thomas awake. "Your turn to watch," the doctor said. "I need a few hours of sleep. If his breathing changes or the fever spikes higher, wake me immediately." Thomas took up his position beside Samuel's bedside, a damp cloth in hand to wipe the boy's fevered brow. In the lamplight, the child looked even more fragile and vulnerable. Thomas found himself wondering about Samuel's family. Did he have parents searching frantically for him? Brothers or sisters? A community that mourned his disappearance? The night stretched on, measured in slow breaths and the occasional sound. From the street outside, a horse's whinny, men's voices raised in argument, the distant howl of a coyote in the hills. Thomas refreshed the cloth periodically, speaking softly to Samuel even though the boy couldn't hear him. "You're safe now," he murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you. You just rest and get better." As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Samuel's eyes fluttered open. The boy looked around in confusion and fear, his gaze finally settling on Thomas. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weathered cowboy and the Apache child, two people from worlds that were supposed to be enemies. Then Samuel did something unexpected. Despite his weakness, despite the pain he must have been in, the boy's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile before his eyes closed again, and he drifted back into sleep. It was, Thomas thought, the most hopeful thing he had seen in a very long time. The morning sun brought more than just light to Copper Ridge. It brought Clayton Vickers and his entire ranch crew to Doc Harlan's doorstep. Thomas heard them coming before he saw them, the heavy thud of boots on the wooden sidewalk, and the jingle of spurs creating a symphony of intimidation. He stood from his chair beside Samuel's bed and moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. Vickers stood at the center of a group of 15 men, his black hat and lawn duster coat making him look like a vulture surveying carrion. The ranch owner was in his early 50s, with a weathered face and cold gray eyes that had witnessed and caused more than their share of violence. He had built the Double Cross Ranch from nothing, carving his empire out of hostile territory. Through sheer ruthlessness, men who crossed intended to disappear or leave the territory entirely. Whitfield. Vickers's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Get out here. We need to have words." Doc Harlan appeared from the back room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He took one look at the assembled crowd and shook his head. "This is a medical facility, not a town hall. Tell Vickers to come back during proper visiting hours." "I don't think they're here for a social call, Doc," Thomas replied, his hand unconsciously checking that his pistol was secure in its holster. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All the more reason not to let them in. You've done nothing wrong, Thomas. Standing your ground isn't a crime in this territory. But Thomas knew that legal and practical were two different things in a place like Copper Ridge. The nearest territorial marshal was 3 days' ride away, and by the time any official authority arrived, whatever was going to happen would be long finished. Justice here was determined by who had the most guns and the will to use them. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him. He didn't want this confrontation happening anywhere near Samuel, who was finally resting peacefully after fighting his fever all night. The boy's temperature had dropped just before dawn, not broken entirely, but enough to give hope. The morning air was cool, and a light breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. The street was empty except for Vickers's men, though Thomas could see faces pressed against windows up and down the block. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew something was about to happen, and like spectators at a hanging, they wanted to witness it from a safe distance. "Mr. Vickers," Thomas said, keeping his voice level and respectful, "what can I do for you? You can explain why you brought an Apache savage into our town and expect to continue drawing wages from my ranch." Vickers's tone was conversational, almost pleasant, which made it all the more dangerous. This was a man who could order a killing with a smile. "Found a dying child on the road," Thomas replied simply. "Couldn't leave him to die, couldn't you?" Vickers tilted his head, genuinely curious. "Most men in your position would have done exactly that. Some might have even put the creature out of its misery and saved us all this trouble." Thomas felt his jaw tighten, but forced himself to remain calm. "He's not a creature. He's a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Whatever his people have done, he's innocent." Jack Cordell stepped forward from the group, his hand resting on his pistol. "There's no such thing as an innocent Apache, Whitfield. They're born killers, every last one of them. That boy you're protecting? In 10 years he'll be raiding settlements and taking scalps. You've saved a future murderer." "You don't know that," Thomas countered. "And even if it were true, it doesn't change what he is right now, a child who needed help." Marcus Fleming, the foreman, spoke up for the first time. His voice lacked the venom of Cordell's but carried a weight of genuine pain. "My brother was 23 when the Apache killed him, Thomas. They tortured him for hours before they let him die. His wife found what was left of him tied to a tree, and the sight drove her mad. She's in an asylum in Santa Fe now, and she'll never recover. So you'll forgive me if I don't share your charitable view of Apache mercy." Thomas met Fleming's eyes and saw the raw grief there. He understood it. The man had every right to his anger and his hatred, but understanding didn't mean agreeing. "I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus, truly, but taking vengeance on a child won't bring your brother back or heal his widow's mind. It'll just add another body to the count and make you into the same kind of man who killed him." Fleming's expression hardened. "Don't you dare compare me to them. I'm not," Thomas said quickly. "I'm saying we all have a choice about who we become. The Apache who killed your brother made their choice. Now you have to make yours." Vickers had been watching this exchange with interest, his calculating eyes moving between Thomas and his foreman. Now he spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Noble sentiments, Whitfield. Your mother taught you well. I remember she was always taking in strays and lost causes. But this isn't about philosophy or morality. This is about survival. The Apache aren't going to see your act of kindness as anything other than weakness. And when they come for that boy, and they will come, they're going to burn this town to the ground. Or," Thomas suggested, "they might see it as a gesture of good faith, a sign that not all white men want them dead. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a first step toward peace." Cordell laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Peace with the Apache? You really are a fool, Whitfield. They don't want peace. They want their land back, and they'll kill every one of us to get it. Can you blame them?" The words were out before Thomas could stop them. "We took their territory, killed their buffalo, broke every treaty we ever made with them. We pushed them into the worst land and expected them to starve quietly. Of course they're fighting back." A dangerous silence fell over the group. Several hands moved toward weapons. Thomas realized he had just crossed a line that most men in the territory wouldn't dare approach. Sympathizing with the Apache wasn't just unpopular. It was seen as outright betrayal. Vickers's face had gone hard as stone. "I built my ranch on land I bought legally from the territorial government. I've employed hundreds of men, brought civilization to this godforsaken valley. And you're telling me I'm the villain because some savages can't accept that progress has left them behind. I'm saying it's more complicated than good versus evil." Thomas replied, knowing he was digging his grave deeper with every word, but unable to stop. "The Apache are fighting for their survival, same as we are. Maybe if we tried talking instead of shooting." "Enough." Vickers raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "You've made your position clear, Whitfield. Now let me make mine clear. You're fired. Collect whatever belongings you left at the bunkhouse, and be gone from Double Cross land by sunset. If I see you there after dark, I'll treat you as a trespasser." Thomas had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. The Double Cross had been his home for 2 years, the longest he'd stayed anywhere since his mother's death. His few possessions were there, some clothes, his spare rifle, a photograph of his mother that was one of his most prized possessions. "I understand," Thomas said quietly. "I'll be gone." "And the Apache brat?" Cordell interjected. "What happens to him?" "He stays under my care until he's well enough to travel." Doc Harlan's voice came from the doorway. The doctor stood there with his arms crossed, his thin frame somehow radiating defiance. "And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the Territorial Medical Board. I answer to them, not to you, Clayton." Vickers turned his cold gaze on Harlan. "You're making a mistake, Doc. This town depends on you. Be ashamed if something happened that made you want to leave." "Is that a threat?" Harlan asked mildly. "It's a statement of fact," Vickers replied. "Towns can be unpleasant places for people who forget which side they're on." Funny thing about being a doctor, Harlan said. I'm not on any side except the side of keeping people alive. You might want to remember that next time you or one of your men needs medical attention. It was a bold countermove, and Thomas saw. Several of the ranch hands exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harlan was the only doctor within 3 days' ride. Alienating him completely could have serious consequences for everyone in the region. Vickers seemed to recognize this as well. His expression didn't change, but Thomas detected a slight shift in his posture, a grudging acceptance that he'd pushed as far as he could for now. The boy lives for now, Vickers said. But if he's still in this town in 1 week, I'll take that as proof that Copper Ridge has chosen to harbor enemies of civilized people, and I'll act accordingly. He swept his gaze across the faces watching. From windows and doorways. That goes for all of you. 1 week. With that, Vickers turned and strode away, his men following like a pack of wolves trailing their alpha. Thomas watched them go, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. He'd stood his ground, but the cost was becoming clearer by the moment. You should have stayed inside, Harlan said quietly once the street was clear. Would have come to the same thing eventually, Thomas replied. At least this way, we know where we stand. And where's that exactly? Neck deep in trouble with the water rising. Harlan snorted, the closest thing to a laugh Thomas had heard from the usually serious doctor. Come inside. Samuel woke up while you were playing hero out here. He's asking for water. Thomas's fatigue evaporated instantly. He's conscious? And asking for things? More or less. He's weak as a kitten, but he's aware. That fever breaking was the best thing that could have happened. Now we just need to get some food in him and keep those wounds clean. They went inside to find Samuel propped up slightly on pillows, his dark eyes following their movements. The boy looked fragile and frightened, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar room like a trapped animal searching for escape routes. When his eyes landed on Thomas, though, some of the fear seemed to fade. Thomas approached slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. He picked up a tin cup of water and held it out. Here you go, son. Nice and slow. Samuel hesitated, then reached for the cup with both hands. They trembled badly, and Thomas had to help support the weight. The boy drank carefully, his throat working to swallow the precious liquid. When he finished, he handed the cup back and spoke a single word in Apache. Thomas looked at Harlan helplessly. Any idea what he said? Not a word. But if I had to guess, I'd say it was either thank you or more water. It turned out to be both. Over the next hour, Thomas and Harlan worked together to get more water into Samuel, along with some warm broth that the boy sipped cautiously. Every swallow seemed to restore a bit more life to his small frame. By mid-morning, he was able to sit up with minimal assistance, though he still looked exhausted and pained. The boy watched Thomas with an intensity that was unsettling. It wasn't hostility or fear. It was something more like curiosity mixed with confusion. Thomas understood the feeling. Samuel was trying to reconcile what he'd been taught about white men with the reality of being cared for by one. What do you think happened to him? Thomas asked Harlan quietly while Samuel dozed in the afternoon. How does a child end up alone in the desert like that? Harlan cleaned his instruments as he considered the question. Could be a dozen different things. Maybe his band was attacked and scattered, and he got separated in the chaos. Maybe he wandered off and got lost. Or maybe, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Maybe what? Maybe he was cast out, Harlan finished. Some tribes have traditions about children who are born under bad omens or who show certain weaknesses. They're seen as cursed and abandoned to die. It's rare, but it happens. Thomas looked at the sleeping boy, at the peaceful expression on his thin face. The idea that Samuel's own people might have left him to die was somehow worse than imagining him lost or separated by violence. We can't know for sure, Harlan added. And it doesn't change what we need to do, get him healthy and figure out what comes next. What came next arrived sooner than either of them expected. Just after sunset, as Thomas was preparing to spend another night on the floor of Harlan's office, a sharp knock came at the door. Harlan answered it to find a young boy, no more than 12, standing on the threshold with a folded piece of paper. "From Miss Catherine Wright," the boy said, handing over the note before scampering off into the darkness. Harlan opened the note and read it quickly, his expression growing serious. He handed it to Thomas without comment. The message was brief and written in elegant script. "Mr. Whitfield, I heard about your situation and wish to help. Please come to my home at your earliest convenience. We have much to discuss. Catherine." Wright. Thomas knew of Catherine Wright, though he'd never spoken to her directly. She was one of the few educated women in Copper Ridge, a schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston 3 years earlier. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town and had a reputation for independence. That made many of the townspeople uncomfortable. An unmarried woman living without family or male protection was unusual enough. One who spoke her mind and ran her own life was practically scandalous. "Interesting," Harlan said. "Catherine doesn't involve herself in town politics usually. Must be something important if she's reaching out now." Thomas looked at Samuel, who was sleeping soundly, his breathing steady and deep. The boy seemed stable enough to leave for a short while. "Will you watch him if I go?" Thomas asked. "Of course. But be careful, Thomas. A man in your position can't afford any more complications. Bit late for that, Doc." Thomas made his way through the dark streets of Copper Ridge, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the pools of light spilling from saloon windows. Catherine Wright's home was a modest wood-frame structure with a small garden out front of a remarkable achievement in the desert climate that spoke to both determination and skill. He knocked softly, and the door opened almost immediately. Catherine Wright stood in the doorway, lamplight from inside silhouetting her slender frame. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent blue eyes that assessed him quickly. "Mr. Whitfield, thank you for coming. Please come inside." The interior of her home was unlike anything Thomas had seen in Copper Ridge. Books lined every wall, hundreds of them, more books than most frontier towns had in total. A comfortable sitting area was arranged near a stone fireplace, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. "Forgive the informality of my invitation," Catherine said, gesturing for him to sit. "But circumstances don't allow for proper social niceties. I'll be direct. You've created quite a stir with your rescue of that Apache child." "So I've noticed," Thomas said dryly. "What you may not have noticed is that you've also created a debate in this town. Not everyone agrees with Vickers and his men. There are people here who believe you did the right thing, who are tired of the endless cycle of violence." This was news to Thomas. From his perspective, the entire town seemed united in their hostility. "How many people?" he asked. "Enough to matter," Catherine replied. "The problem is that they're afraid to speak up. Vickers controls most of the employment in this valley. People who cross him find themselves without work, without credit at the store, effectively run out of the territory." "Then why tell me this? What can I do about it?" Catherine leaned forward, her expression intense. "You can stand your ground. You can show them that it's possible to do what's right, even when it's difficult. And you can accept help from those of us who want to offer it." "What kind of help? Food, supplies, money if you need it. A place to stay once you're forced out of the doctor's office. Protection, if it comes to that." She paused. "I'm not the only one, Mr. Whitfield. There's George Patterson, who runs the stable. Margaret Chun, who owns the boarding house. Reverend Michaels, though he has to be careful about being too public with his support. Even Raymond Morrison at the general store, though he'll deny it if asked directly." Thomas felt something loosening in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. He wasn't completely alone in this. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why risk Vickers's anger?" Catherine smiled sadly. Because some of us came to this territory hoping to build something better than what we left behind. A place where justice meant more than the fastest gun or the biggest ranch. What you did, showing mercy to a helpless child, that's the kind of thing that makes a settlement into a real community. If we let Vickers and his men crush that impulse, we lose something essential. She stood and moved to a shelf, returning with a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. This is from the people I mentioned. It's not much, but it should cover your expenses for a few weeks. Consider it an investment in the kind of town we want Copper Ridge to become. Thomas stared at the pouch, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing. Care for that boy. Show this town that there's another way besides hatred and violence. As Thomas walked back to Doc Harlan's office with the pouch heavy in his pocket, he felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He'd thought his decision to save Samuel was a simple choice between right and wrong. Now he was beginning to understand that it was something much larger, a test of what kind of place Copper Ridge would become, and whether mercy had any place in the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. Above him, the stars blazed in the desert sky, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere out in that vast darkness, Samuel's people were searching for him. And when they found him, when they discovered their child was alive in the hands of their enemies, everything would change. Thomas just hoped that change would be for the better. 3 days had passed since Vickers issued his ultimatum, and Samuel was growing stronger by the hour. The boy could now sit up without assistance, eat solid food, and even take a few tentative steps around Doc Harlan's office with Thomas's support. But with physical recovery came a new challenge: communication. Samuel spoke no English, and Thomas knew no Apache. They existed in a frustrating silence, broken only by gestures and the occasional shared smile. Thomas found himself wishing desperately for some way to bridge the gap between them. To understand the boy's story and let him know he was safe, the answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas was helping Samuel practice walking. When Doc Harlan entered with a visitor, a weathered Mexican man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands gnarled by decades of hard labor. His name was Eduardo Vasquez, and he worked as a handyman around Copper Ridge, taking on odd jobs that others considered beneath them. "Mr. Whitfield," Harlan said, "Eduardo has something to tell you." "Go ahead, Eduardo." The older man shifted his hat nervously in his hands. "My grandmother, she was Apache, Chiricahua band. I grew up speaking both Spanish and her language before she died. I hear about the boy, and I think maybe I can help." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "You speak Apache?" "Some," Eduardo admitted. "Been many years, and there are different dialects. But I can try." Samuel had been watching this exchange warily from his seat on the examination table. When Eduardo approached and spoke to him in Apache, the boy's eyes went wide with shock. For a moment, he simply stared. Then words came tumbling out, a desperate flood of language that spoke of relief at finally being understood. Eduardo listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, his expression growing more troubled as Samuel's story unfolded. When the boy finally fell silent, exhausted by the effort, Eduardo turned to Thomas and Harlan with tears in his eyes. "His name is not Samuel," Eduardo began quietly. "It is Naco, which means bear in his language. He is 8 summers old, and he comes from a small band led by his grandfather, a man called Victorio, though not the famous warrior, a different man with the same name." "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. "How did he end up alone?" Eduardo's voice grew heavy. 3 weeks ago, the cavalry attacked their camp at dawn. The soldiers came without warning, without provocation. Naco's people were peaceful. They had stayed away from settlements, hunted only in the mountains, caused no trouble. But the soldiers did not care about this distinction. Thomas felt his stomach turn. He'd heard stories about the Army's Apache campaigns, But hearing it from the perspective of a survivor made it visceral and real. Nako's mother threw him on a horse and told him to ride, Eduardo continued. She said to run and not look back. He heard gunfire and screaming, but he obeyed. He rode for hours until the horse collapsed. Then he walked. He did not know where to go, only that he had to keep moving. The head wound that came from falling from the horse. The other injuries from trying to find food and water in the desert. His family? Harlan asked, though the answer was clear in his tone. He does not know if anyone survived. He was alone for many days before Mr. Whitfield found him. The room fell silent as the weight of this settled over them. Thomas looked at Nako. He still thought of him as Samuel, the name providing a strange comfort, and saw the boy watching him with an expression that was heartbreaking in its complexity. Fear, hope, grief, and something that might have been the beginning of trust all warred in those dark eyes. "Tell him," Thomas said slowly, "that he's safe here. Tell him that I won't let anyone hurt him, and that we'll help him find his people if any survived." Eduardo translated, and Nako responded with a question. "He wants to know why you helped him," Eduardo said. "He was taught that white men kill Apache on sight. He does not understand why you did not leave him to die." Thomas considered this carefully, knowing that his answer would shape how this child viewed the world going forward. "Tell him that not all people are the same, just as not all Apache are the same. Tell him that my mother taught me that every life has value, and that kindness is never wasted, even when it's difficult." As Eduardo translated, Thomas saw something shift in Nako's expression. The boy spoke again, his voice stronger now. "He says his grandfather taught him something similar," Eduardo reported. "That the world is full of darkness, but a single flame can hold it back. He says maybe you are a flame." Before Thomas could respond, the door burst open and Jack Cordell stood there with Pete Donovan and 3 other ranch hands. They were all armed, and the smell of whiskey rolled off them like a physical presence. "Well, isn't this touching?" Cordell slurred, his hand resting on his pistol. The Indian lover having a heart-to-heart with his pet savage and a Mexican. Doc Harlan stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruders and his patients. "This is a medical facility, Cordell. You have no business here, especially not drunk." "We got business wherever we say we got business, old man," Donovan spat. He was the youngest of Vickers's crew, barely 20, with more bravado than sense. "Word around town is you're teaching that Apache brat English, planning to make him all civilized." "That's true, Whitfield." Thomas moved to stand beside Harlan, his hand instinctively moving near his gun. Behind him, he could sense Nako tensing, the boy's instincts screaming danger even if he didn't understand the words. "We're helping a child recover from near death," Thomas said evenly. "If that offends you, that's your problem, not mine." "Our problem," Cordell snarled, "is that you've got 4 more days to get that Apache out of town. And we're here to make sure you understand what happens if you don't." He drew his pistol, not aiming it, just letting it hang loose at his side in an obvious threat. The other men followed suit, 5 guns against 2. "Eduardo," Thomas said quietly without taking his eyes off Cordell. "Get Nako to the back room." The older man moved quickly, helping the boy down from the table and ushering him toward the rear of the building. Nako resisted, saying something urgent in Apache, but Eduardo spoke firmly and got him moving. Once they were out of immediate danger, Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least the boy wouldn't see it. "Put the guns away, Jack," Harlan said tiredly. "This isn't accomplishing anything except making you all look like cowards. 5 armed men against 2 unarmed ones and a child." "We ain't cowards," Donovan shouted, his face flushing red. "We're patriots. We're protecting our town from savages and the fools who help them." "By threatening a doctor?" Thomas asked. "By terrorizing a sick child? That's not protection. That's just cruelty dressed up as righteousness." Cordell's eyes narrowed dangerously. You got a smart mouth, Whitfield. Maybe someone ought to teach you to shut it. You're welcome to try, Thomas replied, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. But you better make your first shot count, because you won't get a second one. The threat hung in the air between them. Cordell was drunk, but he wasn't stupid. He could see the absolute certainty in Thomas's eyes, the promise that any violence would be met with lethal response. The other men shifted nervously, suddenly less eager for confrontation when faced with the reality of what it would cost. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the sound of horses outside. Heavy footsteps on the wooden sidewalk preceded the arrival of Marcus Fleming, sober and serious with George Patterson, the stable owner. Beside him, Fleming took in the scene with a single glance, the drawn weapons, the tense postures, the barely contained violence. What the hell is going on here? Fleming demanded. Just having a conversation with Whitfield about his departure schedule, Cordell said, though he holstered his weapon as he spoke. With 5 guns drawn? Fleming's voice was hard. That's not a conversation, Jack. That's an execution waiting to happen. And it's not happening on my watch. Since when do you care about protecting Indian lovers? Donovan challenged. Fleming turned on the younger man with such sudden fury that Donovan actually stepped back. I care about preventing murder, you fool. You think the territorial marshal won't hear about 5 drunk cowboys shooting an unarmed man? You think Vickers wants that kind of attention on his operation? The mention of Vickers seemed to penetrate even Cordell's whiskey-soaked reasoning. The ranch owner wouldn't appreciate his men creating problems that could bring federal law enforcement sniffing around. We were just making a point, Cordell muttered. Point made, Fleming said. Now get back to the ranch before you do something that gets us all hanged. He waited until Cordell and his men had filed out, then turned to Thomas. You're testing everyone's patience, Whitfield. Don't mistake this intervention for support. I still want you and that Apache gone. But I won't stand by and watch murder happen just because someone's had too much whiskey and too little sense. Appreciate it, Thomas said simply. After Fleming left, George Patterson remained. The stable owner was a compact man in his 50s, with steady hands and a reputation for honesty. He waited until the street was clear before speaking. Catherine Wright asked me to check on you, he said. She was worried after hearing about Cordell's drinking at the saloon. Looks like she was right to worry. Tell her thank you for sending Fleming, Thomas said. Though I'm surprised he came. Marcus is complicated, Patterson explained. He hates the Apache, that's true, has every reason to. But he's not a murderer, and he's not stupid. He knows that if you and the boy get killed, this whole situation escalates beyond anyone's control. There'd be an investigation, maybe federal troops deployed, definitely attention that Vickers doesn't want. So he's protecting his boss's interests, not us. Does it matter? Patterson shrugged. You're alive, the boy's alive. Take the win. After Patterson left, Eduardo emerged from the back room with Naco. The boy looked shaken, but unharmed. He said something to Eduardo, who translated. He says those men wanted to kill you. He says he knows what that looks like because he saw it happen to his family. He's asking why you protected him when it would be safer to let him go. Thomas knelt down so he was at eye level with Naco. He spoke slowly, looking directly into the boy's eyes, trusting Eduardo to translate accurately. Because protecting people who can't protect themselves is what separates us from animals. Because every choice we make either adds light to the world or darkness. And because I believe that you have just as much right to live as anyone in this town, regardless of what some people think. As Eduardo translated, Thomas saw tears begin to roll down Naco's cheeks. The boy stepped forward and wrapped his thin arms around Thomas in a fierce hug. For a moment, Thomas froze, unsure how to respond. Then he returned the embrace. Feeling the boy trembling against him, when they separated, Naco spoke again. his voice thick with emotion. "He says you are truly a flame in the darkness," Eduardo translated, "and that his grandfather would have been honored to know you." That night, Thomas lay awake on his pallet, listening to Nako's peaceful breathing. The boy had insisted on sleeping near Thomas rather than in the back room, some instinct telling him that safety lay in proximity to this strange white man who had saved his life. Thomas thought about the choice he'd made on that dusty road just days ago. It had seemed so simple at the time: help a dying child. But that single decision had created ripples that were spreading wider by the hour. He'd lost his job, made enemies of powerful men, and put himself directly in the path of violence. And yet, looking at the sleeping boy, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. His mother had believed that every act of kindness echoed through eternity, changing things in ways large and small. Thomas had always found that notion a bit romantic, a bit naive. But maybe she'd been right. Maybe Nako would remember this kindness and let it shape how he saw the world. Maybe some of the townspeople who'd witnessed Thomas's stand would find their own courage to choose mercy over vengeance. Or maybe he was just a fool who'd gotten himself in over his head and would end up dead in a ditch. Somewhere. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas was helping Nako practice English words, simple things like water, bread, and thank you, when a knock came at the door. Doc Harlan answered it to find a small Apache woman standing there, her weathered face carved by years of hardship and loss. She spoke in Apache, her voice urgent, and Eduardo was quickly summoned. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, with the woman repeatedly pointing toward the mountains and then at the building where Nako was hidden. Finally, Eduardo turned to Thomas, his expression grave. "This is Nako's aunt, his mother's sister. Her name is Desba. She says she has been searching for the boy since the attack on their camp. She tracked him to this area and has been watching the town from the hills, trying to understand what happened to him." "She's been watching us?" Thomas asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. If one Apache woman had been observing Copper Ridge undetected, how many others might be out there? "For 2 days, Eduardo confirmed. "She saw Nako through the window yesterday. She knows he is alive and being cared for. She wants to take him back to what remains of her people." Thomas's first instinct was relief. Nako would be reunited with his family, removed from the powder keg that Copper Ridge had become. But then he looked at the boy, who had frozen at the sound of his language, hope and fear warring on his young face. Nako spoke rapidly to his aunt, and Desba responded with equal intensity. Eduardo translated the exchange. "Nako is telling her what happened, how you found him and saved his life. How you have protected him from the other white men who wanted him dead. Desba is. She is skeptical. She says white men do not help Apache children. Tell her she's welcome to see for herself," Thomas said. "Nako has been cared for, fed, his wounds treated. He's welcome to go with her if that's what he wants. I won't stop him." As Eduardo translated, Desba's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. She stepped inside cautiously, as if expecting a trap. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the medical supplies, the clean bandages, the food on the table. Then she looked at Nako, really looked at him, and saw a healthy, healing boy rather than the near corpse she must have feared finding. She approached Nako and examined him carefully, checking his wounds, asking questions. The boy answered, and with each response, Desba's expression grew more astonished. Finally, she turned to Thomas and spoke at length. "She says she does not understand you," Eduardo translated. "Her experience has taught her that all white men are enemies. But she sees that you have saved her nephew's life and asked nothing in return. She wants to know why." Thomas had answered this question so many times in the past few days that he'd worn the words smooth like river stones. But this time felt different. This time, he was answering to someone who had every reason to hate him and his people. someone whose world had been shattered by men who looked just like him. "Tell her," Thomas said carefully, "that I helped Nako because he was a child in need, and because I believe there has been enough killing, enough suffering on both sides. Tell her that I cannot change what has been done to her people, but I can choose who I want to be. And I choose to be someone who helps rather than harms." Eduardo translated, and Desba studied Thomas for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She extended her hand. Thomas took it, feeling the calluses and scars that marked a life of incredible hardship. Her grip was firm, her eyes clear and direct. She spoke again, and Eduardo's voice was thick with emotion as he translated. "She says that if there were more flames like you in the world, perhaps her people and yours would not be enemies. She says that Nako may stay with you until he is fully healed, if you are willing. It would not be safe for him to travel yet, and her band is scattered in the mountains with little food and no medicine. She trusts that you will continue to care for him." "But," Thomas started, thinking of Vickers's deadline, of Cordell's threats. Desba wasn't finished. She spoke for several more minutes, her voice growing stronger and more authoritative. "She says her people know you are in danger from the other white men," Eduardo translated. "They have been watching, and they understand that your kindness has made you an enemy to your own people. She says this is wrong, and that no good deed should be punished. She says her people will not forget what you have done." With that cryptic statement, Desba embraced Nako one final time, speaking softly to him in Apache. Then she turned and walked out of the doctor's office, disappearing into the streets of Copper Ridge as silently as she had arrived. Thomas looked at Eduardo, bewildered. What did she mean by that last part? About her people not forgetting? Eduardo's expression was unreadable. "Among the Apache, debts must be repaid. You saved one of their children. In their eyes, you have bound them to you with honor. What form that repayment takes?" He shrugged. "That remains to be seen." That night, Thomas stood on the porch of Doc Harlan's office, watching the mountains darken against the sunset. Somewhere out there, Desba was making her way back to her people. And somewhere out there, the Apache were watching Copper Ridge with new eyes, seeing perhaps not just enemies, but at least one man who had chosen a different path. Thomas had 2 days left before Vickers's deadline expired. 2 days to figure out what came next, how to protect Nako while honoring Desba's trust in him. 2 days before everything came to a head. He didn't know it yet, but the Apache were already making their own plans. And when those plans came to fruition, the entire territory would learn that mercy, unlike violence, creates allies where there were once only enemies. The day before Vickers's deadline dawned cold and gray, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like a physical manifestation of the tension gripping Copper Ridge. Thomas woke to find Nako already awake, sitting by the window and staring at those distant peaks with an expression of longing that needed no translation. "You miss them," Thomas said softly, knowing Eduardo wouldn't arrive for another hour, but feeling the need to speak anyway. Nako turned and seemed to understand the sentiment, if not the words. He nodded slowly, then pointed at Thomas and placed his hand over his heart. The gesture was clear gratitude and affection, mixed with the pain of separation from his people. Doc Harlan emerged from his sleeping quarters, looking more haggard than Thomas had ever seen him. The strain of the past week had etched new lines into the doctor's face, and his hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" Thomas asked. "Kept thinking about what happens tomorrow," Harlan admitted. "Vickers doesn't make idle threats. When that deadline passes, things are going to get ugly. Then maybe Nako and I should leave before that happens. Head out tonight, get far enough away that Copper Ridge isn't caught in the middle. And go where, exactly?" Harlan set down his cup with more force than necessary. "You have no money, no supplies, and nowhere to take that boy. His people are scattered in the mountains, and you don't know where to find them. You'd both die out there, Or worse, you'd run into a cavalry patrol that wouldn't ask questions before shooting. Thomas knew the doctor was right. But the helpless feeling of being trapped was eating at him. So what do we do? Wait for Vickers to make his move and hope we can survive it. Before Harlan could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Angry voices, the sound of breaking glass, and then a woman's scream cut through the morning quiet. Thomas grabbed his gun belt and rushed to the door, Harlan right behind him. The street had transformed into chaos. A mob of at least 30 men, led by Clayton Vickers himself, had gathered outside Catherine Wright's home. Someone had thrown rocks through her windows, and the schoolteacher stood on her porch with a shotgun in her hands, her face pale but determined. "You want to harbor Indian sympathizers?" Vickers shouted at her, loud enough for the entire town to hear. "Fine, but you can do it somewhere else. You have until noon to pack your belongings and get out of Copper Ridge. That goes for everyone who's been helping Whitfield." Thomas started forward, but Doc Harlan grabbed his arm. "Don't. That's exactly what he wants, you rushing in to play hero so he can claim self-defense when he kills you. I can't just let him terrorize Catherine because of me." Thomas protested. "You can and you will. Because charging in there helps no one." Harlan's voice was steel. "Catherine knew the risks when she reached out to you. She's tougher than she looks." As if to prove his point, Catherine's voice rang out clear and strong across the street. "This is my property, Mr. Vickers, purchased legally and paid for in full. You have no authority to order me anywhere. And if you or any of your men set foot on my land without permission, I will exercise my legal right to defend it." Several of the men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Catherine Wright might be an unmarried woman living alone, but she was also educated, articulate, and clearly knowledgeable about territorial law. Shooting her in cold blood would create the kind of legal complications that even Vickers's money and influence might not be able to smooth over. Vickers's face darkened with rage. "You're making a mistake, Miss Wright. A woman alone in this territory needs friends. You're burning those bridges awfully fast." "Then I'll learn to swim," Catherine replied coolly. "Now get off my property before I add trespassing charges to the report I'll be filing with the territorial marshal." For a moment, Thomas thought Vickers might order his men forward anyway, consequences be damned. But the ranch owner was too calculating for that. He'd made his point: anyone who supported Thomas would face consequences. Pushing it to actual violence against a respectable white woman would undermine his position. "Noon tomorrow," Vickers repeated, redirecting his attention to the general crowd. "That's when Whitfield and his Apache pet need to be gone. Anyone standing with him can join them in exile." He turned and strode away, his men following like a tide dot as the crowd dispersed. Thomas noticed faces watching from windows and doorways. Some showed satisfaction at the intimidation tactics. Others showed shame or fear. And a precious few, showed quiet defiance. George Patterson appeared at Thomas's elbow, seemingly from nowhere. "Meeting tonight at the church," he murmured. "Midnight. Those of us who haven't been cowed want to talk about strategy." He was gone before Thomas could respond, melting back into the dispersing crowd. The rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas helped Nako continue his English lessons, teaching him practical words and phrases while Eduardo translated more complex concepts. The boy was a quick learner, his young mind absorbing the new language with impressive speed. By afternoon, he could string together simple sentences. "Thank you for help. I am hungry, and most importantly, you are my friend." That last one hit Thomas harder than he expected. Friendship seemed too small a word for the bond that had formed between them, forged in crisis and sealed with trust. Nako represented something Thomas hadn't fully articulated, even to himself: proof that the cycle of hatred could be broken. That people from warring worlds could see each other's humanity if given the chance. As darkness fell, Thomas prepared to slip out to the midnight meeting. He left Naco in Doc Arlen's care, though the boy protested, clearly understanding that Thomas was going somewhere potentially dangerous. "I'll be back," Thomas promised, using one of the Apache phrases Eduardo had taught him. "Stay safe." The church sat on the northern edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a cross that was perpetually crooked, no matter how many times Reverend Michaels straightened it. Thomas approached from the back, using the shadows and his knowledge of the town's layout to avoid being seen. The last thing he needed was one of Vickers's men reporting his movements. Inside, the church was lit by a single candle near the altar. As Thomas's eyes adjusted, he could make out perhaps a dozen figures seated in the pews. Catherine Wright was there, along with George Patterson, Eduardo Vasquez, and Margaret Chen from the boarding house. Reverend Michael stood near the pulpit, his usually jovial face grave with concern. There were others too, a young couple Thomas recognized from the general store, an older woman who ran a small laundry service, and several men whose faces he knew but whose names escaped him. "Thank you all for coming," Reverend Michaels began quietly. "We're here because tomorrow this town faces a choice. We can let Clayton Vickers dictate our morality through threats and violence, or we can stand for what's right, regardless of the cost." "Easy for you to say, Reverend," one of the men spoke up. "You don't have a family to feed. Vickers controls most of the work in this valley. Cross him, and we starve." "Then we find other work," Catherine interjected. "There are other towns, other territories. But if we surrender our principles because we're afraid, we lose something far more valuable than employment." "Pretty words," the man shot back. "But my children need food, not principles." Thomas had remained silent until now, but he felt compelled to speak. "No one asked you to sacrifice anything for me. I appreciate you coming tonight, but I won't let anyone suffer because of my choice. Naco and I will leave tomorrow before the deadline. Maybe that will be enough to satisfy Vickers." "It won't," George Patterson said flatly. "You think this is really about the Apache boy? Vickers is using this situation to consolidate power, to show everyone in Copper Ridge that he's the ultimate authority. If he breaks you, he sends a message to everyone else: step out of line. And this is what happens. Letting you leave just proves his tactics work." "So what do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "We make a stand? Fight Vickers and his crew? That's suicide." "Not fight," Catherine said thoughtfully. "Resist. There's a difference. Vickers's power comes from fear and economic control. We counter that with solidarity. Everyone in this room commits to supporting each other, sharing resources, creating an alternative economy that doesn't depend on his goodwill." Margaret Chun leaned forward, her weathered face determined. "I can house people who lose their employment. The boarding house is mine free, and Clear Vickers can't touch it. We can feed maybe a dozen people, more if we're careful. I've got money saved," the young woman from the general store added. "Not much, but enough to help buy supplies if things get tight." One by one, others began offering what they could: labor, skills, resources. Thomas watched in amazement as this small group transformed from frightened individuals into something more cohesive, more powerful. They were creating exactly what Catherine had described: a community bound by shared values rather than fear. "This is all very inspiring," a new voice cut through the planning. Everyone turned to see Marcus Fleming standing in the doorway of the church. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Fleming raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to start trouble. Then why are you here?" Reverend Michaels asked warily. Fleming stepped into the candlelight, and Thomas could see the conflict written across his face. "Because I've been thinking about what Whitfield said, about choosing who we become. And I've been thinking about my brother." The room fell silent, everyone aware of Fleming's history with the Apache. "My brother was a good man," Fleming continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Kind, generous, always quick to help someone in need. When the Apache killed him, they didn't just take his life, they took the future he should have had, the children he would have raised, all the good he would have done in the world. That loss, it carved something out of me that can never be filled." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "But here's what I realized tonight, lying awake and staring at the ceiling. If I let that loss turn me into someone who would hurt a child, someone who would stand by while innocent people suffer, just because I'm afraid or angry, then the Apache didn't just kill my brother. They killed who I was too. They made me into someone he wouldn't recognize, wouldn't respect." Fleming looked directly at Thomas. "You saved that boy because it was right, not because it was easy or safe. That's what my brother would have done. So I'm here to say that if Vickers moves against you tomorrow, he'll have to go through me first." The weight of that statement hung in the air. Marcus Fleming was Vickers's foreman, his most trusted lieutenant. His defection was more than just symbolic. It was a fracture in the ranch owner's authority that could spread. "You understand what you're giving up?" Catherine asked gently. "My job, my reputation with half the territory, probably any chance of a peaceful life in Copper Ridge," Fleming replied. "Yeah, I understand. But I also understand that some things matter more than comfort and security. My brother taught me that, even if it took me too long to remember." Before anyone could respond, the church door burst open and Pete Donovan stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Apache!" he gasped. "Dozens of them, maybe more. They've surrounded the town." Chaos erupted. People jumped to their feet, reaching for weapons, voices rising in panic. Thomas felt his heart plummet. This was it, the disaster he'd been dreading. Naco's people had come for him, and Copper Ridge would pay the price. "Everyone calm down." Reverend Michaels's voice cut through the panic. "Pete, tell us exactly what you saw." Donovan was breathing hard, his eyes wide with fear. "I was on night watch at the ranch, up on the North Ridge. Started seeing fires in the hill signal fires, I think. Then movement in the darkness, lots of it. Warriors, had to be. They're all around us. Did they attack?" Fleming demanded. "No, that's the strange part. They're just there, watching, waiting." Thomas's mind raced. Why would the Apache surround the town but not attack? It didn't make tactical sense unless the answer hit him like a physical blow. They were protecting him. Desba had said her people would not forget his kindness, that debts must be repaid. This was their answer, a show of force that said anyone who harmed Thomas or Naco would face consequences. "I need to talk to them," Thomas said urgently. "Are you insane?" Donovan shouted. "They'll kill you on sight." "No," Thomas said with sudden certainty. "They won't. This isn't a raiding party, it's a message to Vickers. They're telling him that if he makes a move against Naco or me, he starts a war he can't win." Catherine grasped the implication immediately. "That's brilliant. They've changed the entire calculation. Vickers was counting on everyone being too afraid to oppose him. But now he has to weigh his pride against the possibility of a full Apache assault. We need to get word to Vickers," Fleming said. "Let him know the situation has changed." "I'll go," Thomas volunteered. "He needs to hear this from me." The ride to the Double Cross Ranch took only 20 minutes, but Thomas spent every second of it watching the darkness, knowing he was being observed by unseen eyes. He could feel the presence of Apache warriors in the hills, a pressure against his awareness like the air before a thunderstorm. The ranch house was ablaze with light, and armed men patrolled every approach. Thomas was stopped at gunpoint 3 times before finally being brought before Clayton Vickers, who stood on his porch with a rifle cradled in his arms. "You've got the nerve coming here, Whitfield," Vickers said coldly. "Especially tonight. We need to talk about what happens tomorrow," Thomas replied. "The situation has changed. I'm aware that Apache warriors are surrounding my town," Vickers snapped. That just proves my point. Harboring that boy has brought disaster on all of us. Or it's saved us, Thomas countered. Those warriors aren't here to raid. They're here to make sure Nako stays safe. Which means as long as he's unharmed, they have no reason to attack. You force me out or hurt that boy, and they have every reason. Vickers's eyes narrowed as he worked through the implications. You're telling me I'm being held hostage by savages because of your bleeding heart? I'm telling you that we have an opportunity for peace. The Apache have shown they can honor a debt, respect a life saved. That's more than most people in this territory give them credit for. Maybe it's time we tried a different approach. And if I reject this opportunity? Vickers asked. If I decide to call their bluff and run you out anyway? Thomas met his gaze steadily. Then a lot of people die, yours, theirs, and probably innocent townspeople caught in the crossfire. All because you couldn't accept that mercy might be stronger than violence. Your choice. For a long moment, Vickers said nothing. Thomas could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, weighing his pride against the lives of his men, his property, his empire. Finally, the ranch owner lowered his rifle. The deadline is suspended, Vickers said, each word clearly costing him. For now. But this isn't over, Whitfield. Not by a long shot. Thomas nodded slowly. It wasn't friendship or even acceptance, but it was survival. For now, that was enough. As he rode back toward town, Thomas looked up at the hills where the signal fires still burned. He didn't know if Desba or other Apache leaders were up there watching. But he raised his hand in a gesture of respect and gratitude, somewhere in the darkness. He thought he saw a figure raise a hand in return. The first battle was over. Won not through violence, but through the unexpected power of honor acknowledged and debts repaid. But Thomas knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come in the days ahead, whether this fragile peace could be nurtured into something lasting, or whether the old hatreds would rise again to consume everything they'd built. For tonight, though, there was hope. And sometimes hope was the rarest and most valuable commodity in the entire territory. Dawn broke over Copper Ridge with an eerie calm that felt more like the eye of a hurricane and true peace. Thomas stood on the porch of Doc Harlan's office, watching as the signal fires in the hills slowly died out with the rising sun. The Apache were still there. He could feel their presence like a weight in the air, but they had pulled back slightly, a gesture that seemed designed to ease tensions without completely abandoning their position. Nako joined him, the boy moving with increasing confidence now that his strength had returned. He followed Thomas's gaze to the mountains and spoke in halting English. My people. They protect you now. They do, Thomas agreed. But protection can only last so long. Eventually, we need to find a real solution. The boy's face grew serious beyond his years. You give me life. They give you life. This is balance? Thomas smiled despite the weight on his shoulders. Yeah, kid. That's balance. The town stirred slowly to life, but the normal rhythms felt off. Fewer people ventured onto the streets, and those who did moved quickly, nervously, always aware of the watching eyes in the hills. The Broken Spur Saloon remained closed, its owner apparently deciding that serving whiskey to armed, anxious men was a recipe for disaster. Around mid-morning, a delegation arrived at the doctor's office. Marcus Fleming led the group, which included Reverend Michaels, Catherine Wright, George Patterson, and surprisingly Raymond Morrison from the general store. Their expressions were a mix of determination and exhaustion. We need to discuss next steps, Fleming said without preamble. Vickers has suspended his deadline, but he's not going to let this stand forever. We have a window, maybe a few days, to figure out something permanent. What did you have in mind? Thomas asked. Ushering them inside, Catherine spoke first, her schoolteacher's mind already working through the problem analytically. The core issue is trust or the lack of it. The settlers don't trust the Apache. The Apache don't trust the settlers. And both sides have excellent reasons for their distrust. But you've proven something important, Thomas. You've shown that individuals can bridge that gap. So we need more bridges, Morrison added. The store owner had been quiet throughout the crisis, but his presence here spoke volumes. More contact, more opportunities for people to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. That's a nice idea, Fleming said, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. But how do we accomplish it when most people in this territory would shoot an Apache on sight, and most Apache would return the favor? Eduardo Vasquez, who had been sitting quietly with Naco, finally spoke up. There is a way, but it requires something that will be difficult for many to accept. It requires a treaty, not with the government or the army, but between the people of this town and Naco's band directly. A local peace agreement? Reverend Michaels leaned forward, intrigued. That's unorthodox. The army wouldn't recognize it, and the territorial government would likely see it as undermining their authority. Let them, Catherine said firmly. What have the official policies accomplished except more death? We have a unique opportunity here, an Apache band willing to consider peace because of a genuine act of kindness, and a community that's at least partially willing to try something different. Thomas looked around the room, seeing the hope and fear warring on every face. Even if we wanted to negotiate something like that, how would we even start? I can't just walk into the hills and ask to speak to their leaders. Yes, you can, a voice said from the doorway. Everyone spun to find Desba standing there, having apparently entered through the back of the building without anyone noticing. She spoke in Apache, and Eduardo quickly translated. She says her grandfather, the leader of their band, wishes to meet with Thomas and any others who seek peace. He has been watching what happened here and believes there may be a path forward. But it must happen soon, before the army or other settlers learn about the Apache presence and force a confrontation. It could be a trap, Fleming warned, his protective instincts overriding his newfound openness. Get Thomas out in the wilderness and eliminate the problem. Desba responded through Eduardo, her tone sharp. If we wished Thomas dead, he would already be dead. We could have killed him a dozen times over the past days. We seek peace, not more blood. Naco suddenly stood and walked to his aunt, speaking rapidly in Apache. The exchange was intense, with the boy gesturing emphatically toward Thomas. Finally, Desba nodded and turned back to the group. Naco says he will guarantee Thomas's safety with his own life, Eduardo translated. Among our people, such a pledge is sacred. No harm can come to Thomas without first going through Naco, and no warrior would harm the child he rescued. The weight of that statement settled over the room. This 8-year-old boy, still recovering from near death, was offering himself as collateral for Thomas's safety. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring. I'll go, Thomas said immediately. When and where? Tomorrow at first light, Eduardo translated Desba's response. There is a canyon 15 miles north, marked by a split rock formation. Naco will guide you. You may bring 2 others if you wish no more. They must come unarmed as a sign of good faith. Fleming immediately volunteered. I'll go. If we're going to negotiate peace, having someone who understands both sides of this conflict might help. I should come as well, Reverend Michaels added. As a spiritual leader, I might provide some moral authority to whatever agreements we reach. The plan was set, but the rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas tried to prepare for the meeting, but how did one prepare for something that had never been done before? He wasn't a diplomat or a politician, he was just a ranch hand who had made a choice in a dusty road and was now somehow responsible for potentially reshaping the relationship between 2 warring peoples. That evening, as Thomas helped Naco pack supplies for the journey, the boy suddenly hugged him fiercely. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. You are my brother now, Naco said carefully in English, the words clearly practiced. Not by blood, by choice. This is stronger. Thomas felt his own eyes burning. You're my brother too, kid. Always will be. The night was long and sleepless. Thomas lay on his pallet, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his mother. She had believed that every act of kindness echoed through eternity, changing things in ways both seen and unseen. If she could see what her teachings had created, an entire community reconsidering their hatred, a potential peace born from a single moment of compassion, what would she think? He hoped she would be proud. Dawn came too quickly and not fast enough. Thomas Fleming and Reverend Michaels gathered outside the doctor's office, where Nako waited with 3 horses that George Patterson had provided. The boy sat his mount with natural grace, looking more like a young warrior than the dying child Thomas had found just days ago. The ride north was tense but uneventful. Nako led them through terrain that would have been difficult to navigate alone, narrow passes, hidden trails, and game paths that only someone intimately familiar with the land would know. As they rode, Thomas noticed subtle signs of the Apache presence, a broken branch here, a disturbed rock there, markers that said they were being watched and guided. The split rock formation appeared just as the sun reached its peak. 2 massive stone pillars that had been cleaved apart by some ancient geological event. In the shadow between them, a group of Apache warriors waited, perhaps 60 in number. All armed, but with their weapons lowered in a gesture of truce. At the center of the group stood an old man, his face weathered by decades of desert sun and hardship. His hair was white, but his eyes were sharp and penetrating. This was Victorio, Nako's grandfather, and the leader of the band. Nako dismounted and ran to his grandfather, and the reunion between them was tender and heartbreaking. The old man held his grandson close, speaking softly in Apache, his weathered hands checking the boy for injuries with a grandfather's concern. Finally, Victorio straightened and approached Thomas. Eduardo Vasquez had accompanied them, appearing seemingly from nowhere to translate. "You are the one who saved my grandson," Victorio said through Eduardo. "I am told you did this knowing he was Apache, knowing it would bring you trouble with your own people. I am told you protected him when others wanted him dead. Is this true?" "It is," Thomas replied simply. "Why?" The question was direct, demanding an honest answer. Thomas took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Because he was a child who needed help. Because I believe there has been too much killing on both sides. Because I was taught that every life has value, regardless of who they are or where they come from. And because I hoped that maybe, just maybe, one act of kindness could start to break the cycle of hatred." Victorio studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You speak with a straight tongue. This is rare among white men, among all men, if we are honest." He gestured to the warriors surrounding them. "These men have lost friends, brothers, fathers to your people. Some have lost wives and children. They have every reason to want you dead. But they are here today because of what you did for Nako. You have shown them that not all whites are the same. Just as I hope Nako has shown you that not all Apache are the same." Marcus Fleming stepped forward, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "I've lost family to Apache raids. My brother was killed, tortured, and left to die. I hated your people for it, maybe part of me still does. But I've learned something these past days. Hatred is easy. It requires no courage, no thought, no growth. Peace, real peace that takes strength. That takes people willing to see past their pain to imagine something better." Victorio's expression softened slightly. "You speak wisdom that has cost you much to learn. This too is rare." He turned to address all 3 visitors. "My people are tired. We are tired of running, tired of watching our children starve, tired of burying our dead. The old ways are dying, and we cannot stop that. But perhaps we can choose how we die, with honor and dignity, or as desperate animals hunted to extinction. What are you proposing?" Reverend Michaels asked gently. "A covenant," Victorio replied through Eduardo. Not with the government that has broken every promise, but with the people of Copper Ridge, directly. My band will remain in the mountains, living as we have always lived. We will not raid your settlement or harm your people. In return, you will allow us to trade for supplies we cannot make ourselves, and you will not report our presence to the army. We will share this land as our ancestors once shared it with other tribes, with respect and honor. That's asking the people of Copper Ridge to violate federal law, Fleming pointed out. The army has orders to round up all Apache and force them onto reservations. And we have seen what happens to our people on reservations, Victorio countered. They sicken and die, their spirits broken. We would rather die free in these mountains than slowly on reservation land. But if your people are willing to look the other way, to let us live in peace, we will give you something valuable in return. What's that? Thomas asked. Safety, Victorio said simply. These mountains are full of dangers, hostile tribes, bandits, outlaws fleeing justice. My warriors know every trail, every water source, every hiding place. We will protect the people of Copper Ridge from these threats. Any enemy of yours becomes our enemy. This is the Apache way. We honor our debts, and we protect those who have proven themselves friends. It was an audacious proposal, and Thomas could see Fleming and Reverend Michaels processing the implications. What Victorio was offering was essentially a mutual defense pact, a relationship built on practical benefits rather than empty promises or government treaties that no one believed in. This would require the support of the entire town, Thomas said carefully. Not everyone will agree. Vickers and his supporters will have to choose, Victorio interrupted. Stand with those who seek peace, or stand alone against both the Apache and their own neighbors. I have seen what happened in your town, how people gathered in secret to support you. There are more who hunger for peace than you realize. They have simply been afraid to speak. A young warrior stepped forward and spoke urgently to Victorio. The old man listened, then turned back to the visitors with a grave expression. Scouts report that a cavalry patrol is approaching from the south, perhaps 2 days away. They are searching for Apache to force onto reservations. This is the test of what we discuss here today. Will Copper Ridge stand with us, or will they reveal our location to the soldiers? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment where words would have to become actions, where principles would be tested against reality. Thomas looked at Fleming and Reverend Michaels, saw his own determination reflected in their faces, and made his choice. We'll stand with you, Thomas said firmly. I can't speak for everyone in Copper Ridge, but I'll do everything in my power to convince them that peace is worth protecting. As will I, Fleming added. And one, Reverend Michaels confirmed. Victorio nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. Then we have an understanding. Return to your people. Convince them that a new path is possible. My warriors will remain in the hills, watching and waiting. When the soldiers come, we will see if your words match your courage. The ride back to Copper Ridge was quiet, each man lost in thought about the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were essentially asking the townspeople to commit treason, to actively conceal the presence of Apache from federal authorities. The penalty for such actions could be severe, ranging from fines to imprisonment to being branded as traitors. But as they crested the final ridge and saw Copper Ridge spread out below them, Thomas felt a strange sense of certainty. What they were doing was right, even if the law said otherwise. Sometimes justice and legality diverged, and when they did, you had to choose which master to serve. The town meeting that evening was the most heavily attended gathering in Copper Ridge's history. Every resident seemed to have crammed into the church, with more standing outside, trying to hear through the open windows. Thomas, Fleming, and Reverend Michael stood at the front, with Nako beside them, a living symbol of what was at stake. Thomas spoke first, laying out everything that had happened, the meeting with Victorio, The proposed covenant, the approaching cavalry patrol, and the choice that now faced every person in the room. "I won't lie to you," Thomas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church. "What we're asking is dangerous. It goes against the territorial government, against the army, against everything we've been told about the Apache. But I've seen something these past days that gives me hope. I've seen a child who should have died alone in the desert become a bridge between worlds. I've seen enemies become allies through simple acts of honor. And I've seen this community come together in ways I never thought possible." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some hostile, some hopeful, most simply uncertain. "The cavalry will be here in 2 days," Thomas continued. "When they come, they'll ask if we've seen an Apache in these mountains. We can tell them yes, and watch as they hunt down Victorio's band and force them onto a reservation where they'll likely die. Or we can say we've seen nothing and give peace a chance to take root. The choice is yours." Clayton Vickers stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back, his presence commanding immediate attention. "And if we make this choice, if we harbor Apache and lie to federal authorities, what happens when we're caught? What happens to our families, our livelihoods, our futures?" "We face those consequences together," Catherine Wright said, standing to face the ranch owner. "The same way we face everything else in this territory, by supporting each other and believing that we're strong enough to weather any storm." "Together," Vickers scoffed. "You mean like how you all gathered in secret to undermine my authority? Like how you turned my own foreman against me?" He glared at Fleming, who met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't need help undermining your authority, Clayton," Fleming replied quietly. "You did that yourself when you put your pride above the welfare of this community. I didn't turn against you, I remembered who I wanted to be." The tension in the room ratcheted higher. This was the moment that would define Copper Ridge's future, and everyone could feel it. Margaret Chin stood up, her small frame somehow commanding attention. "I came to this territory 30 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream of building something lasting. I've survived droughts, fires, bandits, and more winters than I care to count. And I've learned one thing for certain: survival means adapting. The old ways of endless conflict aren't working. Maybe it's time we tried something new." One by one, others began to stand. George Patterson, Eduardo Vasquez, the young couple from the general store. Even Raymond Morrison, always the practical businessman, rose to his feet. "Show of hands," Reverend Michaels called out. "All those in favor of accepting Victorio's proposal and protecting the Apache from the cavalry. Raise your hand." The response wasn't unanimous. Perhaps a third of the room kept their hands down, including Vickers and several of his men. But more than half the assembled townspeople raised their hands high, a clear majority choosing peace over the certainty of continued conflict. Vickers looked around the room, clearly calculating the cost of fighting this tide. Finally he spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "I won't support this madness, but I won't actively oppose it either. When it all falls apart, and it will, don't come crying to me for help." He strode out of the church, several of his loyalists following, but far more people remained. And as Thomas looked at their faces, determined, frightened, hopeful, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in Copper Ridge. They had chosen to become something more than just another frontier town built on violence and fear. They had chosen to become a community. 2 days later, the cavalry patrol arrived exactly as predicted. Captain William Hendricks was a career officer with a reputation for thoroughness. He rode into Copper Ridge with 30 soldiers, all armed and ready for conflict. Thomas Fleming and Reverend Michaels met him on the main street, with what seemed like the entire town watching from windows and doorways. Captain Hendricks, Reverend Michaels greeted him. "Welcome to Copper Ridge. What brings the cavalry to our humble settlement?" "We're tracking Apache," Hendricks replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills. Our scouts reported signal fires in this area a few days ago. We have orders to round up any Apache we find and escort them to the San Carlos reservation. I'm afraid I can't help you, Captain, Thomas said, his voice steady. We haven't seen any Apache in the area. Hendricks studied him with sharp eyes. Is that so? Because my scouts are rarely wrong, and those signal fires were reported by multiple sources. Signal fires can mean many things, Fleming interjected. Could have been prospectors, hunters, even bandits. These mountains are full of people trying to avoid attention. The captain wasn't convinced, but he also didn't have concrete evidence. He spent 3 days searching the surrounding area, his men combing through valleys and canyons. But the Apache had vanished like smoke, leaving no trace of their presence. During those 3 days, Thomas barely slept. Every knock on the door, every unusual sound, made him fear that someone had betrayed the agreement. But Copper Ridge held firm. Even those who hadn't voted for the covenant kept silent, either because they were persuaded by the majority, or simply because they didn't want to be the one to break the town's united front. Finally, frustrated and empty-handed, Captain Hendricks prepared to leave. This isn't over, he told Thomas on his final morning in town. I know something happened here. I can feel it. And when I figure out what it is, there will be consequences. Captain, Thomas replied calmly, the only thing that happened here is that a community decided to choose peace over violence. If that troubles you, maybe you need to examine your own assumptions. After the cavalry departed, Copper Ridge slowly returned to normal, or rather, to a new normal. Trade began between the town and Victoria's band, with Eduardo serving as mediator. The Apache brought game meat, herbs, and intricate craftwork. The town provided flour, sugar, medicine, and metal tools. Both sides benefited, and gradually, suspicion began to give way to something that might eventually become trust. Naco stayed with Thomas, who had taken up residence in a small cabin on the edge of town provided by the community. The boy attended Catherine's school, learning to read and write in English while teaching his classmates basic Apache phrases. He became a living bridge between worlds, proof that people from different cultures could coexist and even enrich each other's lives. 6 months later, Thomas stood on the same ridge where he'd first found Naco, looking out over the valley. The boy, no longer quite so small, stood beside him, now completely comfortable in both worlds. You think it will last? Naco asked in perfect English. Peace? Thomas considered the question carefully. I don't know. Peace is like a garden. It needs constant tending, constant care. The moment you stop working at it, the weeds of hatred and fear start growing back. Then we keep working, Naco said simply. Because the alternative is unacceptable. Thomas smiled and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Your grandfather would be proud of you, and my mother would be proud of us both. In the distance, smoke rose from Copper Ridge's chimneys, a settlement going about its daily business. And in the mountains beyond, Apache families lived their lives in relative peace, no longer hunted, no longer forced to choose between death and slow starvation on a reservation. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still misunderstandings, still people on both sides who clung to old hatreds. But it was better. And sometimes, better was enough. Thomas had learned something profound in those dusty Arizona hills, that the most revolutionary act in a world built on violence wasn't killing your enemies, but refusing to see them as enemies at all. That mercy, offered without expectation of reward, could accomplish what 1,000 bullets never could. And that sometimes, the smallest choice, stopping to help a dying child on a forgotten road, could change everything. Years later, when historians examined the Apache Wars and the settlement of the Arizona Territory, they would find a curious footnote about a small town called Copper Ridge that somehow avoided the violence that consumed surrounding areas. They would puzzle over this anomaly, searching for explanations in geography or economics or random chance. They would miss the real answer, because it was too simple, too human, too dependent on individual choice to fit neatly into historical narratives about inevitability and manifest destiny. The real answer was a ranch hand named Thomas Whitfield, who chose kindness over convenience on a February afternoon in 1876, and a community that chose to honor that kindness rather than punish it. And sometimes, in a world starved for light, one small flame is all it takes to hold back the darkness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.